workshop is in fact focusing on Delos ideals, as we actually termed it. And we're focusing on this moment and the moment of history that when people meet on Delos and start discussing about the future citizens, they look at, of all things, ancient cities, and they meet on Delos, a deserted island which was heavily urbanized in the late Hellenistic period, and they meet there in order to discuss the future of cities. So we were interested to bring out this element of engagement with the history, but also at the same time how they're looking on the ground, they're looking at this, ruins and papers when this, myself included, will address this aspect, but also at the same time they're looking at technological developments of the time. So they're looking at the invention of the computer, they're looking at going on to Mars. So there's a mix of elements that feeds into this channel of the Delos ideals, and we're very much interested in bringing this out in this first session. And of course, the themes will be actually interlinked between the three workshops, but this is the focus of this first workshop.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, well let's start with our first speaker then, and our first speaker is Emeritus Professor Dimitris Philippidis, Professor of Urban Planning, Department of Architecture, National Technical University of Athens. And Dimitri published his monograph on Konstantinos Doxiadis just in 2015, and has spent a lot of time researching the sort of ancient cities model and the ancient cities paradigm, how this is brought into contemporary planning ideas. And he's also very interested in talking to us, I think, today, not only about classical antiquity, but also about vernacular architecture as well, and that's the relevance of that in the contemporary period. So, Dimitris, over to you. Thank you.
Well, Simon said that the Doxiadis legend, in a way, dimmed for a certain period of time. It never dimmed for me, though, because I happened to be an employee at his office, and I was carrying his legacy all throughout my life. And when the time came to write a book about him, it was, in a way, like a relief, like keeping a promise. So Doxiadis to me was ever alive, and is more alive today after I finished writing that monograph. So if everybody else thinks that Doxiadis has faded, I'm an exception. Okay, but thank you very much for inviting me in this family affair. And I use this.
Αυτό εδώ πηγαίνει μπροστά, αυτό πίσω, αυτό εδώ μπροστά και αυτό είναι πίσω.
Μπροστά, αυτό εδώ.
Αυτό μπροστά, ναι.
Okay. Okay, ευχαριστώ. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. And I'll have to start. Doxiadis persistently strove to dominate the stage in whichever activity he was involved in person, be it a prestigious presentation, an invited lecture, or any of the more demanding Delos symposia. Those who had a chance to see him perform in public would testify that he absolutely relished such carefully staged moments. Furthermore, Doxiadis imbued a similar theatrical flair in his interviews as well as in his writings, be they books, articles, or even internal memos at the DA office. He absolutely mesmerized audiences or readers by artfully dramatizing the issues he dealt with, by turning them into elaborate, fully organized theatrical acts with him as the protagonist. In view of this exceptional talent of his, one could interpret Doxiadis' strategy on any conceivable issue according to its merit as a theatrical prop. One such case would be his targeted, extensive reference to the past. Why appeal to the past in the first place? The past is free of the ambiguities hidden in the future or in the mutability of the present. It can legitimize projections to the future and make them credible. Furthermore, planning tools like density ratios or the hierarchical arrangement of communities would not be affected by the passage of time because, due to their connection to historical precedents, they became timeless. The recognition of the past in Greek culture is essentially funneled through a bipartite relation to pre-Christian antiquity and to the more recent so-called traditional period under Ottoman rule. Coincidentally, this model corresponds to the relation of high to low culture, respectively. This connection is crucial in understanding Doxiadis' use of the notion of tradition. If we examine the contribution of Greek research to the role of the past in Doxiadis, we find that while Doxiadis' reference to antiquity has been extensively studied, his connection to tradition is still kept under wraps in relative obscurity. In more general terms, whenever the issue of tradition is mentioned in interviews in relation to Doxiadis, it follows a rather circumstantial course, as if it were unimportant, perhaps a subject that would damage the vanguard image of Doxiadis. This inequality is based on the viewpoint, popular among proponents of modernism, that antiquity can be deservedly connected to modernism, while tradition is a retrograde force which opposes the progress inherent in modernism. Actually, this is a paradox because the same argument could be easily reversed, or, better still, both these facets of the past could be summoned as supportive of modernity. Such an ambiguity reveals an atmosphere of deceit and artifice connected to the art of theatre. By omitting unfit or embarrassing details, the ideological reduction of the past to a bipartite model like the one discussed above is convincing because it seems impregnable to doubt, a property much appreciated by Doxiadis, the pragmatist. In more colloquial terms, then, one can maintain that the past, as exemplified by ancient and vernacular precedents in Greece, served as a fitting stage set for his performances. The bipartite model of antiquity and tradition fits ideally Doxiadis' spectrum of the past as a paradigm. In view of these multiple references to the past, our first task is to find how the past and tradition as sources of inspiration. Antiquity, to him, was a gold mine of figures, ratios, to be applied directly to physical planning practice, whereas tradition was a subtler reference for contemporary issues of identity and contextualization. The former seemed cerebrally processed and was related to the ultimate scientific tool, mathematics, while the latter seemed emotionally perceived and helped define his attachment to place and society. On the other hand, the strong point of Doxiadis' mentality was that he never faltered. Doubting for him was unthinkable, a betrayal of a set mission. He was either unaware of contrasting aspects in accepted notions of the past, as the above, or he may have a hunch based on strong ideological grounds that such apparent discrepancies were illusory. Namely, that there might be some deeper, unsuspected connection between Greek antiquity and tradition, which allowed their convergence. Our task is to expose this hidden link in Doxiadis and in his milieu. To clear things out, we will resort to the method previously suggested by following two intertwining yet distinct directions. The first refers to Doxiadis' cultural milieu that encouraged and nurtured his stance, whereas the second focuses on Doxiadis' character and mentality. In relation to the first direction, we'll single out two prominent cases only: Dimitris Philippidis and Nikos Kazantzakis, both being one generation older than Doxiadis. Aside from generally being listed together with the above in his so-called generation of the 30s, Doxiadis seems to have certain close affinities with them. As we shall see shortly, Doxiadis was deeply influenced in his conduct by the subtleties of Dimitris Philippidis, and the heroics of Nikos Kazantzakis. Dimitris Philippidis, born 1887 and died 1968, Doxiadis, much revered university teacher and mentor, 26 years older than him, strived throughout his life to attain a synthesis of antiquity and tradition. Moreover, Philippidis, significantly enough, managed to merge high with low cultures, a mix that we claim Doxiadis extensively exploited in his performances. The renowned author Nikos Kazantzakis, born 1883, died 1957, was 30 years older than Doxiadis, also exerted a strong influence on him. This was partially due to the incorporation of Friedrich Nietzsche's theory in his books. Nietzsche's idea perfectly fitted Doxiadis' belief in his worldly mission and his superhuman struggle for the benefit of humanity. Philippidis' infatuation with the mystic properties of numbers has been exhaustively documented by Kostas Chabaos, who is present today here. We additionally know that aside from reviewing it in his vanguard periodical To Trito Mati, the Third Eye, Philippidis subsequently used Doxiadis' theory on polar angles in a number of his projects. Thus, we need no further analysis of this connection, but Philippidis, as noted at the start, managed additionally to merge high with low cultures, which also influenced Doxiadis in his control and use of the past as a form of high drama. Since this illuminates a less known side of him, we'll now refer to Philippidis' historical exhibition of folk art in Athens in 1938. This exhibition included, quote, illustrations in popular pamphlets, woodcuts, calligraphy, and sculpture of the Greek folk, unquote, together with architectural drawings and, quote, decorative paintings of the 18th century mansions, unquote. More specifically, it also showed, quote, measured drawings and photographs, unquote, by 3 architects, paintings of house architecture by a number of artists, a separate section with paintings of 2 folk artists, quote, shadow theater, advertisements, and folk toys. Philippidis was the uncontested mastermind behind this uniquely original mix, which was favorably received by the public. He had brought together, on one hand, architects and artists as representatives of high culture, and on the other, contemporary folk art products and, if possible, their creators as representatives of low culture. This exhibition was ingenious, yet not preposterous. Philippidis was justified to claim that the new art, so-called new art, had helped him see things in a different light. By the way, 1 year earlier, in 1937, Nikos Kazantzakis had published a number of newspaper articles about his travels in the Peloponnese, later collected in the book Journey to the Morea. The ideological ambiguity in the air was expressed in one such article set in the archaeological site of Olympia in the Peloponnese, where he describes a roaring peasant feast with its tumultuous disorder by the river, and then compares it to the conventionally idealized image of ancient Greece. Doxiadis was 24 years old in 1937, and one can surmise that in this tender age he was conscious of the existence of such a contrast described by Kazantzakis. In later life, he would exhibit a genuine interest towards common people he met by chance in his employment. Doxiadis' influential book, titled Architecture in Transition, a manifesto urging contemporary architects to assume a challenging new role, is a notable source of his interest in the potential value hidden in common people and the significance of vernacular architecture. In the first case, Doxiadis asks about today's architect. Is he going to mingle with the common man, even if he has to be an anonymous worker, in order to merge someday remolded by fire? Further on, he argues, we shall have to turn our attention much more to the traditional solutions, for they have a lot to teach us, not only about the locality we're working for, but also about the ecumenic architecture which is developing throughout the world, unquote. We can next trace the influence of the author Nikos Kazantzakis on Doxiadis as a decisive factor that formulated a role imbued with tradition for Doxiadis' fantasy. Young Kazantzakis submitted a tragedy to the Lasanios literary contest in 1909 called O Protomastoras, the Master Mason, based on the renowned Greek folk song The Bridge of Arta. This recounted the story of the master mason's wife, sacrificed and interred in the foundations of the bridge in order to stabilize it, since it had repeatedly fallen apart. The drama was published next year, 1910, and Manolis Kalomiris, the person on top right, the Greek national music composer, turned it into a cantata performed in 1916. Kalomiris reworked the cantata in 1929 and stated that this was a symbol of his life and destiny. When the revised cantata was performed, Doxiadis was just 13 years old. The term Protomastoras was officially used by Doxiadis in the title of an internal conference held exclusively for his employees at Parnis Mountain near Athens in 1962. This is a photograph of the group. In 1963, we find him using the term in the Third Architects' Conference at Nauplion, which was on the contribution of the Greek architect and planner to the country's development, where Doxiadis states that architects should be restricted to the main task and, following tradition, an architect should, quote, once more become an architect, master mason, and constructor, unquote. 80 years later, we find him commenting on two verses by the poet Elitis, excuse me. Yeah, the use of the term God as Protomastoras is appropriate. He is the genuine Protomastoras, and the only thing we can accomplish is to rearrange elements and put the basic elements in a new order. The term still persisted 9 years later for a Protomastoras meeting with 5 of his colleagues. Doxiadis, in contrast, used the humbler term mason when referring to himself. A mason thinks at night and builds during the day. If he has built enough, he knows that in the morning he has to pour the concrete. He seems to prefer being called simply a mason because he wants to profit from the natural gift of the anonymous folk mason to create and find solutions to technical problems in response to Piccion's model of the folk mason. Let us now follow the second lead, exploring Doxiadis' character and mentality. At a first, more intimate level, there is enough evidence to show that Doxiadis purposely, systematically hid his personal sensitivity and generosity behind a theatrical mask of strictness and discipline in order to control his vast so-called empire. His resort to sacred laws derived from antiquity easily fit such a strategy. Strict discipline belies another side of Doxiadis' character. Those who knew him well testify that he was a fervent patriot with a strong belief in his mission to house the needy of the world. These are from Pakistan. His adherence to the notion of place is also well documented. It underlies, regardless of any obviously economic advantage, his choice of Greece as his headquarters location and the consistent exploitation of his Greek identity when hosting prominent foreigners, as in the case of the Delos symposia. One also notices that Doxiadis fluctuates among a set of roles based on chosen ancient philosophers. Once he mused to a correspondent that he felt like Protagoras, who sailed on a small boat from island to island, peddling his wares. On other occasions, he similarly suggested that he considered himself a follower of the planner philosopher Hippodamus, and he repeatedly identified himself with Aristotle on his quest for happiness in the ideal human community, what he called entopia. Although Doxiadis' mind rushed forward in anticipation of the oncoming future, he was consciously attached to an idealized antique past, rendered harmless by omitting its social context. Indeed, these three ancient models belong to an antiquity carefully cleansed of political context. Yet none of them had failed to recognize the social context within which their theories developed. Protagoras was a revolutionary sophist who rocked the foundations of the Athenian society at his time. Hippodamus had in mind a clearly hierarchical model of the society for the settlements he planned. Aristotle, finally, in his Politics, was measuring the pros and cons of existing political systems in his time. The ambitious research project undertaken by the Athens Center of Equistics, called ACE in short, for ancient Greek cities, was typical of his approach. Still, Doxiadis' infatuation with antiquity was, however, an interim step toward advanced abstraction as expressed in numerical relationships. He had already demonstrated this shift in his dissertation, which was in 1936. The use of such numerical values by Doxiadis culminated in the formulation of the equistic scale, the equistic scale, an all-inclusive icon of quantitative and qualitative values. Our discussion so far has dealt with Doxiadis' infatuation with antiquity as a source of planning principles and philosophical concepts. In his context, we conclude that connecting to antiquity automatically led to abstraction, hence to the replacement of language by numerical ratios as a medium of communication. As previously suggested, Doxiadis' alternate use of tradition relates to a sentimental attachment to place and people as tangible, lived history. We therefore have to shift from Doxiadis' character to his cultural background. The earliest evidence of Doxiadis' interest in Greek vernacular architecture is recorded in the 30s. This is testified by his summer trips to Skiros Island to sketch local traditional houses, a customary habit with architectural students then and later, together with his future wife Emma and her brother Arthur Skeppers. Projects from his pre-war architectural office in the Doxiadis archive in Athens also indicate that he followed current trends in Greek architecture, alternating between moderate modernism and simplified classicism, but also in some cases by applying vernacular motifs. Typical of the last case was the use of the insular motifs in the Kostis Bastias house project, Bastias, born 1901 and died 1972, played a major role in cultural matters in Greece in the latter 30s by serving as an appointed director of letters and fine arts in the government. Taking advantage of his influential position, he assigned promising youngsters to key posts and managed to rejuvenate the troubled Royal Theatre organization by pulling it out of its isolation and initiating a daring performance policy, foreign and domestic. Bastias commissioned 3 prestigious projects to Doxiadis: a theatre on the Thessaloniki waterfront. This is Bastias, I'm sorry. This is the theatre in Thessaloniki waterfront. 1,000 seats mobile theatre transported by 16 trucks, and an open theatre on Philopappus Hill in Athens, which remained incomplete. Although these commissions proved that Bastias was encouraging innovation, his house was a typically retrogressive neo-vernacular specimen. Although not directly connected to either of the two, Pikionis and Kazantzakis, Doxiadis' adherence to the movement of the demotic language should be inserted here as yet another sign of his progressiveness. In his assigned position in the government from 1945 to 1950, we just mentioned, Doxiadis urged his employees to use the demotic language and even invited the renowned philologist Manolis Triantafylidis to teach them in the right usage of the language. We initially claimed that there might be a hidden connection between Greek antiquity and tradition. Otherwise, Doxiadis could not accept it as a basis of his pragmatism. Subsequently, we showed that such traits could be traced in various degrees, both in Pikionis and Kazantzakis, and in his theoretical treatises. In this manner, he proved to be an adherent to the interwar group of intellectuals called Generation of the 30s and mentioned before. This is the Doxiadis exhibition, the further end of the picture, in a museum dedicated to this generation in Athens. Despite the intensity of his rhetoric, the discussion of the use of antiquity and tradition by Doxiadis seems inevitably marred by discrepancies, sometimes based on prejudices. Such issues are deeply contaminated due to their ideological saturation, as stated by numerous broader studies by others. We'll cite 4 examples directly connected to the prolific creativity of Doxiadis. The first 2 were previously discussed, but for lack of time we have not mentioned the last 2. Doxiadis' intimate relation to his revered professor Dimitris Pikionis may well be documented, yet their differences have never been adequately explored. To which then extent were their notions of tradition identical? Doxiadis' multiple references to tradition in his book Architecture in Tradition are equally well known. Was his emphasis on universally applied typologies contradictory to the role of contextual creativity? The design of workers' housing sectors in Aspra Spitia, a development in, for the employees of a mine, is presented as a rational approach to the needs of users of rural origin. Is that sufficient to justify the iconography of traditional settlements? This author suggested a link between Pikionis' Karamanos house, built in 1925, based on a Hellenistic model, and Doxiadis' house at Porto Rafti, built in early 1970s. In this connection, irreverent, or is that irreverent, or does it imply that after all Doxiadis was closer in mentality to a stripped-down classicism as interpreted by modernism. We believe that Doxiadis was too sophisticated to allow such obvious discrepancies a free hand. Therefore, his theatrical performance was an automatic defense mechanism in order to provide the essential illusionary atmosphere that would lead to conviction. It was not just a smoke screen, but a conscious strategy to use the past as a practical tool toward action, the ultimate goal. We here emphasize the practical side of his conduct because one is easily led astray by the atmosphere of mystical nostalgia which belies the Master Mason literature, or of a holistic notion of universal unity in architectural expression, thus forgetting that we deal with Doxiadis' ultimate strategy to formulate a practical tool for everyday usage. In this sense, the so-called inherent discrepancies we have traced show a need for an abstraction and transference as readily provided by the theatre. The intensely theatrical character of Doxiadis' approach to the past hence reaches the necessary state of illusion incorporated as mimesis, that is, imitation, in the theatre. Aristotle's definition of ancient drama could be useful in this point. We have established then that tragedy is an imitation of an action which is complete and whole and has some magnitude. Unquote. The internal logic of Doxiadis' theatrical performance connects mimesis to scenography, to a false, unreal construction meant to provide an illusory image of reality. Theatre is, after all, a deceit. We can now better understand a phrase we used at the beginning of this paper. As we suggested then, by being such a gifted actor, Doxiadis provided a historical setting as an artful backdrop which would soften an otherwise cold-blooded technocratic procedure called physical planning or architectural design meant to serve today's masses. Thank you.
Exactly, to take this one step further about the past as a stage, it's interesting to see in fact how in their discussions of the office about planning the Delos symposia and so on, one can notice how Doxiadis himself makes notes and his associates make notes of things like processions in antiquity. So the guidebook of Delos in the private archives of Doxiadis actually has underlined the elements that actually discuss the historical precedent of processions on the island. And these are actually related with, these are referenced in texts that folk dance nowadays in relation to processions, to the sanctuary of Apollo and so on. So this is not completely, I mean, this metaphor that you kind of so evidently used to discuss the use of the past is actually right there. You know, the theatrical aspect of this and is very present in their planning of the symposium. So it's not really a question, it's like a comment of, you know, what I've been seeing also looking at the...
Yes, absolutely. I expressly did not get into that because I thought you would cover that part. So I would have to, it's awkward, you know, since I know that you are dealing with this part. But what I can add to that is that I was really impressed because first you notice that there's this heavy weight of antiquity in order to lure the foreigners into such a trip around the islands. It's like organizing an advertisement for foreigners representatives. I mean, it's very clear. On the other hand, the trick is that once these people come over, he treats them in the Zorba. I mean, he uses the Zorba model there, which is quite a surprise to a lot of them because they believe, or they are told to believe it. I mean, they are very straight. They are very,
Iron.
uptight. Yes, and Doxiadis wants them to loosen up completely, to get drunk, to roll on the sand, to become as part of the landscape and the place. And a lot of people react. There are records of people who are shocked by this, because it is a shock to them. Because first he treats them as famous representatives of the intelligentsia around the world, and then when they come over, he dresses them up as clowns, and they walk around and have a great time. So there's a conflict there. Not to him, though.
This Dionysiac revelry, right? So it's like, initiating them in the theater with Dionysus and so on. So it's at the same time this, it actually fits in the antiquity model of, like, the theater stage, and Dionysus was part of that, in the classical, tradition. So it's, getting them drunk, in fact, is not a contradiction with antiquity. This is the interesting part. So in our whitewashed view of antiquity, it might be, but it actually is not as much of a contradiction as it might seem.
Well, there is a contradiction, though. There is a partial contradiction, because he has them attend ancient Greek drama performances at the time, because he has the schedule, and he goes to certain places where there are performances. So his people, his friends, attend a regular ancient drama performance. And once they're there, and this is very formal and very schematic, and you know how these performances are. Since they are so sacrosanct for Greek culture, you can't touch them, you have to keep them up. So they have this image on one side, and then next morning they are on the beach, and they are having a great time, and they are eating their retsina. And Doxiadis is the first one to do so. I mean, he puts on his swimming trunks, and he leads the way. And this is the important thing. He doesn't allow them to discover this. He is the initiator to all this. So, in a way, officially, all these people come over to be brainwashed for the echistic theory. Okay, this is the official scope. But on the other hand, they get a fantastic lesson, which they would never have gained in their life otherwise. Some recognize it, others are awkward, still others are indignant. I know, because we read their reactions. I mean, they write articles or discuss things here and there. Doxiadis doesn't mind. I mean, in this case, as in many other cases, he's too complex to be put in one little box. He's not a promoter. He's not an advertiser. He's not a planner. He's not a cultural agent. He's not, I don't know, you can put any kind of adjectives, one next to the other. He's everything. And this is the ingenuousness of his personality, that he can include all this in one person and in one activity. That's the important thing. Okay?
Well, it's a wonderful presentation, actually, and I cannot more than agree with the way you are presenting Doxiadis and what's happened in the Delos Symposium. I think this will come up again in the discussion we're going to have this morning. But I have one observation which might be useful perhaps also for the next discussion we're going to have, is about antiquity. I think it makes sense to make the hypothesis at least that antiquity was the pattern of modernity for Doxiadis. It was the rational aspect. I mean, many other things which have to do with symbols and the theater and the experiential can be very important. But the ancient Greeks were supposed to be the rational subjects who could be a pattern for the modern man and planners of modernity, the post-World War period. In a sense, he was exploiting, I think, antiquity in that sense. And the vernacular was another aspect, came in a different sense in the discussion. But I have a question from the point of view of the history of ideas. Do we really have a direct indication or concrete indication that Doxiadis was inspired by Kazantzakis? I mean, it makes sense what you were presenting here. Kazantzakis was a very important personality, and it's rather improbable that he was not influenced by him.
I know.
Do we really have concrete
Evidence.
references? Because I've not seen any. It doesn't mean that they did not exist, but if he was inspired by Kazantzakis in the interwar period, it's something quite different than being inspired in the post-war period. But the interwar period, Kazantzakis was an admirer of the dictatorships of the interwar period. And we have complete texts where he is expressing his admiration of the potentates of the interwar period, like the text on Mussolini, the text on Franco, the text on Lenin and Stalin. And I mean, we have approach.
You are starting a very bad discussion.
No, and I mean, but being influenced by Kazantzakis of the post-World War period, it's something quite different. It's very interesting whether he's really referring.
No, that's a very, very good question. I wondered about that connection myself too, but I was convinced on two grounds. One is that at a certain date after the war, Doxiadis on his birthday was presented by the top echelon in his office by a bound book by Kazantzakis, the Odyssey, the Odyssea, yeah, leather bound and everything. So this was, they wouldn't have given him that gift if it wasn't something very important to him. So they knew that the Odyssey, which was a book that Kazantzakis wrote from before the war and for many years and on many versions, I don't know, 8 or 9 versions complete. And Kazantzakis considered it his masterpiece, that if everything else was lost, this was his representative work. So Doxiadis gets that gift, and to me that was very important. On the other hand, I know that he quotes certain stanzas from it. I mean, he pencil and underlies certain things because Kazantzakis to him, although he doesn't acknowledge that openly, he doesn't. That's true. You're right there. I mean, he doesn't pay homage to him the way he does to Pikionis all the time. Pikionis is always revered and deified, etc., etc. Kazantzakis is it's kept undercover, like Nietzsche also, because I think that behind Kazantzakis is Friedrich Nietzsche. It's not Kazantzakis by himself, and Nietzsche can explain a lot of the political this and that you explained, that you discussed, but I don't want to go into that. Please. So Kazantzakis to me was a hidden source of inspiration, and I think that he kept that secret because it was too much revealing for his own ambition, you understand? Because Kazantzakis was promoting this superhuman thing. Doxiadis was acting in a superhuman way. He never accepted that he was sick or he was tired, or he was there all the time, always alert, always running in front of everybody else. So he was creating a myth. So if he said that Kazantzakis influenced him in that, in a way, he was losing part of that halo, in a way. This is my explanation. But it does exist, I think. And I think the Protomastoras connection is uncontestable. I mean, I mean, it's not by chance that he picks that word, that Kazantzakis was used that thing, and that the mason of the Arta bridge was a mason. It wasn't anybody else. It wasn't a politician or an economist or whatever. He was a mason. And a mason is something very important in society, is the base of society in a way. So I think that my argument stands.
We'll take one more and then we better move on.
Okay. Thank you for your presentation. I just want to share a thought and then add a question perhaps. I think the filter that you're using of theatrical performance, I find it very useful in understanding the case of Doxiadis because it helps us get beyond the rhetoric. We can often analyze the rhetoric, his rhetoric, or in general the rhetoric in architectural history, but in many cases that's not enough. The critical analysis of rhetoric wouldn't get us as far as what you are doing. It's like you help take the analysis a step further beyond the analysis of the rhetoric.
Yeah.
That helped me, that also made me make a connection to some analyses that are done, let's say, by Islam Muzaffar about Doxiadis' relationship to science and how he's making this argument that the science and the scientific rhetoric is often is not, there is on the one hand the scientific rhetoric, and then on the other there is this intuitive use of the data that is not at all scientific but something else. I was thinking that your analysis of the theatrical performance might help us understand that kind of issue that is pointed out about the tension between the rhetoric, the scientific rhetoric and the intuitiveness of the action.
Mm-hmm.
So then I was wondering, and this is the question, I'm just wondering if we could, just like you use the cases of Kazantzakis and Pidionis, could this analysis be done about some of his inspirations of on science, the scientific arguments? I'm just, this is for another talk of yours in the future.
That could be possible, but I never went into that. But thank you for the suggestion. And the only comment I can make is that what you were discussing before, I think that Kostas Tsiambaos has done a lot in that direction. I think we still have quite a lot of work to do on understanding what was happening in the interwar period. That's very important. It's very, very important. It's very difficult for somebody who doesn't have an inside view of that period to understand that what we are today is so much connected to what was happening, that the war was just an artificial limit and nothing else. It really didn't stop anything. Things continued on afterwards. But in the interwar period, things were, in a way, I think, more concentrated. Things were happening more intensely than afterwards. Although there was so much difficulty, we had dictatorships, we had all kinds of difficulties, an economic crash, all this. But besides all this, we have, maybe this is an illusion of historicism, I don't know, of historical writing, that we compress things into a history and we think that this is reality, whereas we compare it with today, where we have this diluted idea of the present and what's happening. But I have come to respect a lot the interwar periods, as well as in other cases, none of the Doxiadis cases. I learned to respect a lot what was happening in the 19th century. The 19th century was the real big creative century. We are nothing in comparison. Oh yeah, okay.
Thank you very much.